We hired a professional, Mr. Thorne. Someone to watch your every move, to document every little deviation from the community standards you swore to uphold. We'll find whatever it is you're hiding, and we will use it to remove you. The voice belonged to Karen Miller, president of the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association, and it was laced with the kind of triumphant venom that only a person with a sliver of unearned power can truly muster. She stood on my perfectly manicured lawn, a floral print muumuu stretched taut over her considerable frame, her face a mask of smug certainty. Her finger, tipped with a chipped coral pink nail, was pointed not at me but at the offending object, my front door. It was painted hunter green, a deep, dignified color I'd chosen to complement the red brick of my house. According to Bylaw 7, Section 4, Paragraph C, all exterior doors had to be one of 3 approved shades of beige: desert sand, timid taupe, or aggressive ecru. My refusal to repaint it had now apparently escalated to the level of hiring a private investigator to shadow a retired Army colonel. The sheer, glorious absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I let the silence hang in the humid afternoon air, my expression as neutral as I could make it, a skill honed over 30 years of dealing with colonels far more intimidating than this one. Her threat, meant to shatter my composure, landed with all the impact of a cotton ball on a tank. I saw the flicker of annoyance in her eyes when I didn't immediately capitulate or erupt in anger. She wanted a reaction, a confirmation of her power. I would give her none. This was her declaration of war over a can of paint, and she had just unwittingly handed me the entire strategic playbook, the high ground, and a battalion of invisible soldiers she didn't even know existed. She thought she was lighting a fuse to my life. She had no idea she was standing on a powder keg of her own making, holding a lit match. If you've ever been on the receiving end of a power trip from someone who thinks a plastic name badge makes them a general, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I want to hear your own HOA nightmare stories, because believe me, what's coming next is a masterclass in how to dismantle one piece by bureaucratic piece. Now, let me tell you how we got here. I bought this house 2 years ago, my final posting after a long career in military intelligence. It was supposed to be my decompression chamber, a quiet corner of the world where my biggest daily challenge would be deciding whether to prune the roses or fertilize the azaleas. My wife Eleanor had passed 5 years prior, and the silence of our old, rambling farmhouse became too loud. This place, a newer construction in a meticulously planned community, seemed like the opposite of all that. It promised order, predictability, and peace. Oak Haven Estates was sold on the idea of community harmony, a place where property values were protected by a covenant of shared standards. I read the thick binder of HOA rules before I signed the papers. I saw the regulations on lawn height, trash can placement, and mailbox design not as restrictions, but as a simple framework for a quiet life. I had spent my life operating within complex rule sets under far higher stakes. A rule about not leaving your garden hose coiled in the front yard seemed laughably trivial. I miscalculated. I failed to account for the human element, specifically the type of person who seeks to govern such a trivial kingdom. Karen Miller was that person. She had been the HOA president for 10 consecutive years, a reign of terror conducted via newsletters and violation notices. My first run-in was minor. My flag, an American flag that had flown over my command post in Afghanistan, was, according to her, 3 inches too wide for the approved flagpole bracket. I received a notice, a crisp white envelope, in my aggressive ecru mailbox. I read it, walked to the hardware store, and bought a new bracket. It was a stupid rule, but compliance was the path of least resistance. Or so I thought. The flag incident was followed by a warning about my newspaper being on the driveway at 6:05 a.m., 5 minutes past the mandated retrieval time. Then a notice about the brand of mulch I used in my flower beds. It was cedar, not the approved cypress blend. Each interaction was a small, calculated assertion of her dominance. I complied with each one, not out of fear, but out of a tactical decision to remain a gray man, to not be a target. I wanted peace, and I was willing to pay for it by using the right kind of wood chips. The door was different. The door was a line. Eleanor had loved that shade of green. It was the color of the shutters on our first home together. Painting it was a small, private act of remembrance, a touch of our shared past on this new, sterile canvas. When the first notice about the door arrived, I responded with a polite letter requesting a variance, citing aesthetic harmony with the brick and personal sentimental value. The denial was swift and cold, a form letter with my name printed in the blank space. I sent a second, more detailed appeal. It was denied without comment. The third notice came with a $100 fine. The fourth, a $200 fine, and a summons to a hearing with the Architectural Review Committee, which consisted of Karen and two of her visibly terrified neighbors who nodded at whatever she said. At the hearing, I presented my case calmly and logically. Karen dismissed it with a wave of her hand. The rules are the rules, Mr. Thorne. They protect our property values. We can't make exceptions for sentiment. That's when she issued her ultimatum. Repaint the door in 7 days or face escalating fines and further disciplinary action. I told her just as calmly that I would not be repainting the door and that I would be happy to see her in civil court over the matter of the fines. That was 2 days ago. Her escalation to hiring a private investigator was a move I hadn't anticipated, not because it was smart, but because it was so wildly disproportionate. It was a classic intelligence blunder. She was so focused on her desired outcome that she failed to properly assess her target or the potential blowback from her own actions. She had no idea who I was. To her, I was just a stubborn old man, a nail that needed to be hammered down. She didn't know that for 30 years my job was to analyze threats, to find weaknesses, and to turn an enemy's aggression into a weapon against them. And she certainly didn't know about Frank Kowalski. We'd served together in the same analysis unit 20 years ago. He was a bulldog, a relentless digger who could find a single misplaced comma in a mountain of signals intelligence. When he retired, he opened his own private investigation and corporate security firm. He was the best I'd ever known. And for the past 6 years, ever since I started a small security consulting business on the side to keep my mind sharp, he had been on my payroll, on a quiet monthly retainer, to handle all my background checks and due diligence work. My phone buzzed in my pocket as Karen waddled back to her golf cart, the official vehicle of the Oak Haven HOA patrol. I looked at the caller ID. It was Frank. I let her get 20 yards away before I answered, a small smile finally touching my lips. "Talk to me, Frank," I said, my eyes still fixed on the retreating golf cart. "Marcus," Frank's gravelly voice came through the phone, "you are not going to believe who just tried to hire me." I leaned against the frame of my beautiful, defiant hunter green door. "Oh, I think I might." The phone call with Frank was short and brutally efficient, a throwback to the way we used to operate when every second counted. There was no wasted banter, just an immediate shift into operational mode. "She called the firm's main line," Frank explained, his voice a low rumble. "Karen Miller, Oak Haven Estates HOA, wants full surveillance on a resident, Marcus Thorne. That's you, right?" I could hear the amusement in his tone, a dry crackle like autumn leaves underfoot. "That's me, Frank. The nail that sticks up." He chuckled. "What in God's name did you do? Run over her prize-winning poodle?" I gave him the short version, the beige tyranny, the mulch mandate, and the final stand over the hunter green door. Frank was silent for a moment, and I could picture him perfectly, leaning back in his worn leather office chair, rubbing his temples. "A door," he finally said, the word dripping with disbelief. "She's authorizing a $5,000 initial retainer for surveillance over a door." The number surprised even me. $5,000 of community funds, money paid by me and my neighbors for lawn care and pool maintenance, was now being weaponized against me for a disagreement over paint swatches. This wasn't just a power trip anymore, it was a gross misuse of fiduciary duty. So what did you tell her? I asked. I told her my schedule was tight, but for a high-priority case like this, I'd make an exception. Quoted her my premium rate, which she accepted without even blinking. She wants daily reports, photos, vehicle tracking, a full workup. She's convinced you're running some kind of criminal enterprise from your garage. This was the moment the entire dynamic of the conflict shifted. Karen thought she was hiring a weapon. In reality, she had just paid my own intelligence asset to launch a counterintelligence operation against her, and she was footing the entire bill. The irony was so rich, it was practically decadent. Okay, Frank, I said, my mind already mapping out the next several moves. Here's the plan. You take the job. You send her a bill every week on the dot, and we are going to give her a show she will never forget. We spent the next hour crafting the narrative. Frank would be the conduit, and I would be the producer, director, and lead actor in a carefully staged drama designed for an audience of one, Karen Miller. Our goal was not just to defend against her attack, but to use her own momentum to drive her straight into a wall. We would feed her a steady diet of information that was tantalizingly suspicious on the surface, but completely innocuous upon closer inspection. We'd create a trail of breadcrumbs so misleading that by the time she tried to present her case, she would look not just foolish, but unhinged. Our first move was scheduled for the next day. The report needed to be simple, something to establish Frank's credibility and whet Karen's appetite for scandal. We decided on a classic, the suspicious package exchange. The following afternoon, I drove to a nearby park. I sat on a bench, enjoying the sunshine, and waited. A few minutes later, my son David, an Army captain himself who was home on leave, pulled up in his dusty pickup truck. He got out carrying a small, heavy-looking canvas duffel bag. We exchanged a brief, firm hug, more for the benefit of our unseen audience than anything else. Then I handed him a thick manila envelope, and he handed me the duffel bag. We spoke for less than a minute before he got back in his truck and drove away. I returned to my car and drove home. From a distance, through the lens of a telephoto camera, the scene would look exactly like a clandestine handoff. A veteran meeting with a younger, military-aged male. An exchange of a package for a payment. It was perfect. That evening, Frank called me. Phase 1 is complete, he said. I got some great shots. Grainy from a distance, just like they see in the movies. Makes it feel more authentic. I'm writing the report now. Subject met with an unidentified white male, approximately 30 years of age, military bearing. A canvas duffel bag of unknown weight and contents was exchanged for a sealed manila envelope. How's that for ominous? I laughed. Perfect, Frank, just perfect. The next morning I saw Karen doing her morning patrol in her golf cart. She drove past my house 3 times, her speed decreasing with each pass. Her eyes were locked on my garage, as if she expected me to be in there assembling a weapon of mass destruction. The bait had been taken. 2 days later, the first official repercussion arrived in my aggressive accrue mailbox. It was a thick envelope, heavier than usual. Inside wasn't just a fine, but a formal notice of investigation. It stated that the HOA board had received credible information suggesting I was engaged in commercial activities from my residence, a direct violation of Bylaw 12, which prohibited running a business that involved client foot traffic or excessive deliveries. The letter, signed by Karen, informed me that I was under official review and that any further suspicious activity could lead to a special assessment against my property to cover the costs of the investigation. She had included a grainy black and white photo of my meeting with David in the park. It was beautifully, terribly misleading. She was building her case, using the very evidence I had manufactured for her. I laid the letter on my kitchen table, a piece of paper that was supposed to intimidate me into submission. Instead, it felt like the first tremor of a distant earthquake, an earthquake that she had started and I was now going to amplify and direct right back at her foundations. I took a photo of the letter and sent it to my lawyer with a simple message. It's begun. Start a file. Then I walked to my garage, took out a can of hunter green paint and a fine-tipped brush, and meticulously touched up a tiny, almost invisible scuff mark on my front door. The arrival of the notice of investigation was the formal declaration of hostilities, and I knew my response had to be as formal and unyielding as her attack. In my career, I learned that bureaucracy can be a suffocating swamp or a formidable weapon, depending on which side of the paperwork you're on. Karen had thrown the first handful of administrative mud, so I resolved to build a fortress of it in return. My first step was to draft a reply. I didn't use emotional language or angry denials. Instead, I crafted a 3-page letter that was a masterpiece of detached, legalistic precision. I addressed each of her points not as accusations but as procedural inquiries. I cited the HOA's own governing documents back at her, quoting the specific bylaws that guaranteed a homeowner's right to privacy and the board's burden of proof. I formally requested, pursuant to State Property Code 209.005, a complete copy of all credible information and source materials used as the basis for the investigation, including the unredacted reports from her retained investigator, complete with time-stamped photographs and chain of custody documentation for all evidence. I also included a clause stating that I interpreted her letter as a formal accusation of illegal activity, and that I was therefore retaining legal counsel. I concluded by informing her that all future correspondence on this matter should be directed to my attorney's office, and any attempt to communicate with me directly would be considered harassment. I sent the letter via certified mail, return receipt requested, a small but significant act that creates an undeniable legal paper trail. The little green postcard that came back with her signature on it was the first brick in my wall. While she was busy figuring out how to respond to my legal broadside, Frank and I were already planning our next theatrical production. We needed to escalate the narrative, to feed Karen's growing paranoia and lead her further down the rabbit hole. We decided the theme for our next operation would be suspicious materials. My prize-winning roses required a specific blend of fertilizers and soil amendments. One of these is blood meal, a nitrogen-rich organic supplement that comes in a plain brown sack and looks to the untrained eye rather sinister. Another is agricultural sulfur, a fine yellow powder used to lower the soil's pH. Frank's next report to Karen was a work of art. It detailed how I had made 2 separate trips to 2 different agricultural supply stores far outside of our suburban enclave. He included photographs of me loading heavy, unmarked brown sacks into the trunk of my car. His report noted with feigned analytical gravity that purchasing such materials from disparate locations is a common tactic used to avoid flagging a single large purchase. He didn't say what was in the bags, he just described them in my counter-surveillance driving patterns, taking a longer, more circuitous route home, which was actually just me enjoying a scenic drive. The report was delivered to Karen on a Friday. I could almost feel the vibrations of her excitement from across the neighborhood. That weekend, she and 2 other board members, a nervous-looking accountant named Gerald and a stern woman named Barb, conducted a walk-around inspection of my property line. They didn't dare step onto my lawn, but they paced the sidewalk, peering into my backyard, their faces a mixture of suspicion and self-importance. They were looking for evidence of a bomb-making factory or a clandestine drug lab. What they saw were my prize-winning Mr. Lincoln roses, bursting with crimson blooms. The irony was completely lost on them. The official notice that followed was even more unhinged than the first. It was a cease and desist order, demanding I stop bringing unidentified and potentially hazardous materials onto my property. It cited a vague bylaw about maintaining community safety and aesthetics. The letter demanded I provide the HOA with a full chemical manifest of any and all substances stored in my garage or shed, and to consent to a voluntary inspection within 48 hours. This was a massive overreach, a clear violation of my rights as a homeowner, and it was exactly the kind of mistake I was hoping she'd make. My lawyer's response was swift and brutal. It was a single page that cited state and federal laws regarding illegal search and seizure. And it reminded the board that an HOA is a civil corporation, not a law enforcement agency. It stated in no uncertain terms that any attempt to enter my property without a legally obtained warrant would be met with a call to the police for trespassing. The letter also included a bill for my attorney's time, which it politely suggested the HOA might be liable for, given that their actions were prompting the legal expenses. I was now costing them money on two fronts: the PI they were paying to watch me and the lawyer I was paying to defend myself from them. While Karen was reeling from this legal pushback, I began my own, quieter investigation. I spent an afternoon at the county clerk's office pulling all the public records for the Oak Haven Estates HOA. I copied years of annual budgets, meeting minutes, and filed liens. I took the box of documents home and spread them across my dining room table. It was a different kind of intelligence work than I was used to, but the principles were the same. Find the pattern, identify the anomaly, follow the money. It didn't take long to find the first thread. For the past 5 years, the HOA's landscaping contract, a massive $60,000 a year expense, had been awarded to a company called Green Pastures Landscaping. A quick business search revealed the owner of Green Pastures was a man named Dennis Miller, Karen's brother-in-law. The meeting minutes showed that Green Pastures was consistently the highest bidder, yet they were awarded the contract every year on a unanimous vote. The pattern was clear. This wasn't just a case of petty tyranny, it was one of systemic graft. Karen wasn't just a power-mad president, she was using the HOA as her personal piggy bank. My little war over a green door had just uncovered a much larger crime. I scanned the relevant documents, compiled them into a neat digital file, and emailed it to Frank with a one-line instruction: dig here. The discovery of the landscaping contract was like finding a loose thread on a cheap sweater. I knew if I pulled it, the whole rotten garment would unravel. Frank, with his professional resources and relentless tenacity, was the perfect man to do the pulling. While he began his deep dive into the financial connections between Karen Miller and her brother-in-law's company, my job was to keep Karen's attention squarely focused on the ridiculous drama we had created for her. We needed to make our next act so compelling, so outrageously suspicious, that she wouldn't have the time or the mental bandwidth to notice the real investigation happening under her nose. We decided to introduce a new character into our play: the shadowy foreign contact. I had an old friend, a former defense attaché from the German embassy named Klaus, who had retired to the area. Klaus was a jovial man with a thick accent, a booming laugh, and a flair for the dramatic. I called him and explained the situation. He thought it was the most hilarious thing he'd ever heard and agreed to play a part immediately. The following Tuesday, Klaus drove to my house in his immaculate black Mercedes sedan, a car that already looked vaguely sinister in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He was dressed in a tailored European-cut suit and dark sunglasses. He parked directly in front of my house, in full view of any prying eyes. I met him at the curb. We didn't shake hands. Instead, we exchanged a curt, formal nod. I handed him a small, locked aluminum briefcase, the kind you see in spy movies. He, in turn, handed me a single, crisp, white envelope with no markings on it. The entire exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. He got back in his car and drove off. The briefcase contained 2 bottles of excellent German Riesling and a block of Limburg cheese. The envelope contained the recipe for his wife's legendary sauerbraten. To an outside observer, it was a textbook intelligence dead drop. Frank, positioned a block away, captured the whole thing in glorious, high-resolution detail. He wrote his report that night, leaning heavily into the espionage angle. He identified the vehicle as being registered to a foreign national. He described the exchange of the locked briefcase and the sealed communiqué. He noted that I took the envelope inside and did not emerge for several hours, and that I later drew all my blinds, which I did every evening. He submitted the report and the photos to Karen. Her reaction was even faster and more frantic than we'd anticipated. The very next day, a new notice was hand-delivered and taped to my hunter green door. This wasn't a standard HOA form letter. This was a 2-page typed manifesto written and signed by Karen herself. It was filled with grammatical errors and wild accusations. She accused me of being a threat to national security. I'm not exaggerating. She used the phrases "suspicious liaisons with foreign agents" and "activities that compromise the safety and integrity of our nation." She demanded I provide a full explanation of my meeting, the identity of my contact, and the contents of the exchanged items. It was a document born of pure, unadulterated paranoia, fueled by the steady drip of Frank's carefully crafted fiction. She had completely lost her grip on reality. My lawyer had to read the letter twice before he stopped laughing. His official response this time was even shorter. It was a single curt paragraph stating that the HOA's accusations were now libelous and defamatory, and that we would be seeking damages. It ended with a stark warning. Cease and desist all forms of surveillance, accusation, and harassment immediately. Govern yourselves accordingly. We knew they wouldn't, of course. Karen had invested too much of her ego and now too much of the HOA's money to back down. She was trapped by the sunk cost fallacy. She had to believe I was a master criminal, because the alternative, that she was a foolish woman being played for a fool over a gallon of paint, was too humiliating to contemplate. Meanwhile, Frank's real investigation was hitting pay dirt. The landscaping contract was just the beginning. By cross-referencing public records with financial filings, he discovered that Dennis Miller's company, Green Pastures, had a history of dissolving and reforming under new names every few years, a classic tactic to shed debt or poor reviews. More importantly, he found a direct money trail. 2 weeks after the HOA paid its quarterly invoice to Green Pastures, a consulting fee of exactly 20% of that amount would be paid from Green Pastures' account to a shell corporation named KM Solutions. The sole proprietor of KM Solutions? Karen Miller. She wasn't just steering a contract to her brother-in-law, she was getting a direct illegal kickback. For 5 years, she had been systematically embezzling 20% of the largest line item in the HOA's budget. It was clean, it was simple, and it was a felony. Frank compiled the bank statements, the invoices, the corporate filings, a neat and tidy package of evidence that would be impossible to refute. He sent it to me in an encrypted file. As I reviewed the documents on my screen, the last vestiges of amusement I felt about the situation evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard anger. This woman wasn't just a petty tyrant, she was a common thief, stealing from her neighbors, from the young families and retirees in this community, to fund her lifestyle. The fight was no longer about my door. It was about justice for everyone in Oakhaven Estates. I now had the weapon I needed to end this, but a quiet victory wasn't enough. Karen had made her accusations public, spreading rumors among the board and her allies. Her downfall needed to be just as public. It needed to happen in front of the very people she had lorded her power over for a decade. The annual HOA meeting was in 3 weeks. The timing was perfect. It would be my stage, and Karen would be the star of the show. All I had to do was make sure she walked right into the spotlight. With the evidence of Karen's embezzlement securely in my possession, the nature of my operation shifted from defense and misdirection to setting a trap. The annual HOA meeting was the perfect venue for a public reckoning. It was the one time all year that a significant portion of the community gathered in one place, and it was ironically the ultimate symbol of Karen's power. Exposing her there would be a surgical strike at the heart of her little empire. But first, I needed to ensure the trap was perfectly laid and that she would walk into it with utter confidence. My role, and Frank's, was to inflate her ego to the bursting point, to make her so sure of her victory that she would overplay her hand in spectacular fashion. We needed one final grand piece of theater. We decided to stage a covert night operation. My house backs up onto a small patch of community-owned woodlands. It's dark, secluded, and perfect for our purposes. Frank's next report to Karen would be his magnum opus of fabricated intelligence. One evening, around 11 p.m., David came over again. We dressed in dark clothing. I had an old military surplus night vision monocular. David had a high-end metal detector. We went into my backyard, and for the next hour, we put on a show for Frank's long-lens camera, which was positioned on a tripod in the woods. We swept the ground with the metal detector. We used small hand trowels to dig in a specific spot near an old oak tree. We consulted a laminated map under the dim red light of a headlamp. Finally, we unearthed a small, heavy metal ammunition box. We carried it carefully back to my garage, casting furtive glances around us as we went. The entire performance was silent, deliberate, and on film would look incredibly damning. The ammunition box, of course, contained nothing more than a collection of my old Army medals and memorabilia that I was planning to mount in a display case for David. Frank's report was a masterpiece of suggestive language. He described the nocturnal incursion, the use of specialized search equipment, and the retrieval of a cached military-grade container. He noted that the subjects operated with a high degree of tactical proficiency. He submitted this final report to Karen, along with a heavily edited dramatic video clip. This was the kill shot to her reason. This was the evidence that would convince her she was dealing with a seasoned spy, not a retired gardener. She took the bait so hard she nearly swallowed the hook, line, and sinker. The very next day, the official notice for the annual homeowners meeting arrived in everyone's mailbox. Tucked into the agenda, right after the treasurer's report and before the election of new board members, was a new special item. A presentation by the board of directors concerning a serious security issue and conduct violations by a resident that threatened the welfare and property values of the community. She didn't name me, but she didn't have to. She was building the drama, priming the audience. She was planning to use the meeting to publicly humiliate me, to present her mountain of evidence, and to railroad a vote to place a lien on my property or even force a sale. This was exactly what I wanted. While Karen was preparing her public execution, I was quietly building an army. I started with the people I knew had been on the receiving end of her petty tyranny. I remembered an elderly widow, Mrs. Gable, who had been fined repeatedly because her bird feeder was attracting unapproved species of birds. I went to her house with a box of pastries and a folder of documents. I sat with her in her living room, and I laid out the evidence of Karen's embezzlement. I showed her the invoices from Green Pastures and the corresponding payments to KM Solutions. Her gentle, wrinkled face hardened as she looked at the numbers. "That woman," she said softly, "told me my finches were a nuisance while she was stealing our money." She agreed to speak at the meeting. Next, I visited the Rodriguez family, a young couple with 2 small children who were constantly being harassed about their kids' toys being left in their own backyard. I showed them the same evidence. Mr. Rodriguez, a quiet man who worked in construction, slammed his fist on his kitchen table. "I work 60 hours a week to pay my HOA dues, and she uses it to go on vacation?" They were in. I repeated this process 5 more times, visiting a diverse group of residents who all had one thing in common: a history of being bullied by Karen Miller over trivial, nonsensical violations. I never told them about my own elaborate counterintelligence operation. I didn't need to. The evidence of her financial crimes was more than enough. I simply presented the facts and asked if they were willing to stand up and speak out. Every single one of them said yes. I provided each of them with a copy of the evidence and coached them on how to present their personal story in a clear, concise, and powerful way. We weren't just going to refute her accusations against me. We were going to launch a full-scale counteroffensive, a barrage of truth from all corners of the community. My lawyer, in the meantime, was preparing the legal ammunition. He drafted a formal recall petition for the entire board of directors, citing gross negligence and malfeasance. He prepared cease and desist letters for the other board members, putting them on notice that their complicity in Karen's actions made them personally liable. He also prepared a comprehensive summary of the financial evidence to be distributed at the meeting. The final piece of the puzzle was Frank. He agreed to attend the meeting, not as my associate, but as the expert witness Karen had hired. He would sit quietly in the back until I called on him. The trap was now fully set. The bait was laid, the allies were in position, and the legal framework was in place. All that was left was for the guest of honor to make her grand entrance and perform the role I had so carefully written for her, the architect of her own destruction. The night before the meeting, I felt a familiar calm settle over me, the same quiet focus that always came before a major operation. I walked out my front door and stood for a moment looking at the deep, rich hunter green paint. It was more than just a color. It had become a symbol of defiance, the small hill I had chosen to defend, which had led to the discovery of a much larger battle that needed to be fought. And tomorrow the war would end. The Oak Haven Estates Community Center was a sterile, beige room usually reserved for potlucks and children's birthday parties. Tonight, however, it was charged with the tense, expectant energy of a courtroom. Nearly 100 residents filled the folding chairs, a record turnout for an annual meeting. They had been drawn by the promise of drama, whispered rumors of the serious security issue Karen had advertised on the agenda. She sat at a long table at the front of the room, flanked by her board of sycophants, Gerald, the treasurer, who was sweating profusely despite the aggressive air conditioning, and Barb, whose lips were pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Karen was in her element. She wore a bright pink blazer that seemed to amplify her presence, a corsage pinned to the lapel, as if she were the guest of honor at a gala. She beamed at the crowd, a benevolent queen surveying her loyal subjects, completely oblivious to the fact that she was sitting on a throne of dynamite. I took a seat in the third row next to Mrs. Gable, who gave my hand a reassuring squeeze. My other allies, the Rodriguezes and the others, were scattered throughout the room, a silent, coordinated network ready to act. Frank was in the back, near the door, looking like any other bored husband dragged to a community meeting, his face impassive. The first part of the meeting was a tedious blur of procedural nonsense. Minutes from the last meeting were approved. Gerald gave a stammering, incomprehensible treasurer's report, his eyes darting nervously around the room. He skipped over the details of the landscaping budget, summarizing it as within expected parameters. I made a mental note of the lie. Then, the moment arrived. Karen stood up, cleared her throat into the microphone, causing a painful squeal of feedback, and smiled a predatory smile. "And now," she announced, her voice resonating with theatrical gravity, "we move to the special presentation. As your president, it is my solemn duty to protect the peace, security, and property values of our wonderful community." She gestured to a projector screen that flickered to life behind her. "For the past several weeks, the board has been conducting a sensitive and necessary investigation into a resident whose behavior has become a source of grave concern." My face appeared on the screen, a grainy, long-distance shot of me standing by my front door. A collective gasp went through the room. Karen let the image hang there for a moment before launching into her indictment. She presented her case like a prosecutor in a cheap television drama, her voice rising with righteous indignation. She showed the photo of my suspicious package exchange with my son David. "Here you see the subject engaged in a clandestine transfer with an unknown operative," she narrated. She showed the photos of me buying fertilizer. "Here he is acquiring large quantities of strange materials, precursors, one might even say, using evasive maneuvers to avoid detection." She played the video of our nighttime operation in the backyard, complete with dramatic slow-motion replays of us digging and finding the ammo can. And here, conclusive proof of the retrieval of a hidden military-grade cache of unknown but certainly dangerous contents. For 15 minutes, she laid out her entire ludicrous narrative. She spoke of my disregard for community standards, starting with the door and escalating to what she implied was a full-blown criminal or espionage enterprise. She painted me as a dangerous outsider, a threat to the neighborhood's very fabric. Her voice dripped with self-congratulation as she detailed the expense and diligence of hiring a top-flight private investigator to uncover my secrets. "The board has spent over $10,000 on this investigation," she declared, as if this were a badge of honor rather than an admission of fiscal insanity. "But we believe it is a small price to pay for securing our peace of mind." She ended her presentation with a flourish, pointing a finger directly at me. "Mr. Thorne, your activities are a clear and present danger to Oak Haven. Therefore, the board proposes an immediate vote on two motions. First, to place a special assessment lien of $20,000 on your property to cover the costs of this investigation and future monitoring. And second, to begin legal proceedings to enforce the covenant and have you removed from our community." And stunned silence fell over the room. People were looking at me, their expressions a mixture of shock, confusion, and for some fear. Karen had played her hand. She had made her accusations public and staked her entire credibility on the evidence I had so carefully fed her. She stood there, basking in the silence, her chest puffed out, waiting for the applause, for the unanimous vote of her grateful subjects. It was my turn. I stood up slowly, calmly, and walked to the single microphone set up for resident comments. I adjusted it to my height, looked out at the faces of my neighbors, and then turned my gaze directly to Karen. "Thank you, Karen," I began, my voice even and steady. "That was a very creative presentation. You've compiled quite a collection of photographs and theories. However, you've made a few critical errors in your analysis." I addressed her first point. "The unknown operative you saw me meeting in the park," I said, pulling out my phone and bringing up a family photo on the screen, "is this man right here, my son, Captain David Thorne of the United States Army. The suspicious package was a duffel bag of his old camping gear he was giving me. The manila envelope I gave him contained photos of his newborn daughter, his first child, my first grandchild." I let that sink in. A murmur went through the crowd. I saw Mrs. Gable smile. I continued, my tone still conversational. "The strange materials I was purchasing were blood meal and agricultural sulfur. They are for my roses, the same roses that your own Community Beautification Committee, which you chair, awarded Garden of the Month to last July." More murmurs. People were starting to look not at me, but at Karen, whose triumphant smile was beginning to curdle. And finally, I said, "The dramatic nighttime recovery of the military-grade cash. That was me and my son again digging up a box of my old Army medals that I had buried for safekeeping years ago. We were retrieving them so I could build a display case for him. The specialized equipment was a metal detector we borrowed from his 10-year-old nephew." I paused, letting the utter foolishness of her narrative collapse under its own weight. "You have spent $10,000 of our money," I said, my voice hardening, my eyes locked on hers, "and to photograph a grandfather spending time with his son and tending his garden." The room was no longer silent. A low buzz of conversation started, a current of disbelief and anger. Karen's face had gone from pink to a blotchy, furious red. "Lies!" she sputtered into her microphone. "He's twisting the truth. The evidence was verified by a professional investigator." "I'm so glad you brought him up," I said, turning to the back of the room, "because your investigator is actually here tonight. Frank, would you mind coming up here for a moment?" A wave of confusion rippled through the audience as Frank Kowalski, the man no one had paid any attention to, stood up from his chair in the back and began a slow, deliberate walk to the front of the room. He was a big man, built like a retired linebacker, and his presence alone commanded attention. He wore a simple blazer and an expression of profound disinterest which only made him seem more authoritative. Karen stared at him, her mouth slightly agape, a flicker of uncertainty finally breaking through her armor of self-righteousness. She had expected her PI to be a shadowy figure, a name on a report, not a real person who would show up at her meeting. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced into the microphone, my voice clear and carrying through the now silent room, "this is Mr. Frank Kowalski. He is, as Karen mentioned, a highly respected private investigator. And it is true that the HOA at Karen's direction hired him to investigate me." I paused for effect. What Karen doesn't know, however, is that Mr. Kowalski has been on a professional retainer with my private consulting firm for the past 6 years. He works for me. The collective gasp in the room was audible. It was a single sharp intake of breath from 100 people at once. Karen's face went from red to a ghostly white. She looked from me to Frank and back again, the gears of her mind grinding as she tried to process the information. She had not only been played, she had paid the opposing team's star player to do it. "Frank," I said, gesturing for him to take the microphone, "I believe you have a report to deliver. Not the one you were paid by the HOA to create, but the one you compiled on my behalf." Frank stepped up to the microphone, his gravelly voice filling the room. "Good evening," he began, his tone flat and professional. My firm was indeed retained by Ms. Miller on behalf of the HOA to conduct surveillance on Mr. Thorne. As is my professional duty, I immediately disclosed this potential conflict of interest to my long-standing client, Mr. Thorne. He instructed me to accept the assignment. He let that statement hang in the air, a tacit confirmation of everything I had just revealed. However, he continued, pulling a thick folder from his briefcase, while conducting the theatrical surveillance requested by Ms. Miller, I was also tasked by Mr. Thorne to conduct a separate, legitimate investigation into the financial governance of the Oak Haven Estates HOA. Gerald, the treasurer, looked like he was about to faint. Barb was staring daggers at Karen. Karen herself seemed frozen, a statue of disbelief and horror. Frank turned to the projector, which still showed a grainy photo of me in my backyard. "If someone could switch the input to my laptop," he said. One of the residents, a tech-savvy teenager, quickly obliged. The image of me was replaced by a crisp, clear PDF of a bank statement. "What you are looking at," Frank explained, his voice a calm, damning monotone, "is the operating account for a landscaping company called Green Pastures. As you know, they hold the lucrative contract for all of our community's groundskeeping." He clicked to the next slide, a corporate filing document. "And this document from the State Comptroller's office shows the registered owner of Green Pastures, Mr. Dennis Miller." He paused. "Karen Miller's brother-in-law." A roar went through the crowd. People were on their feet, shouting, pointing at Karen. She shrank back in her chair, for the first time looking small. "Please," Frank said, holding up a hand, and the room, remarkably, fell silent again. "There's more." He clicked through a series of slides, each one a hammer blow to Karen's credibility. He showed the invoices from Green Pastures to the HOA. He showed the corresponding checks paid out from the HOA's account, signed by Karen and Gerald. Then he showed the final damning piece of evidence. 2 weeks after each payment from the HOA is deposited," Frank said, his voice dropping slightly, "a wire transfer is made from the Green Pastures account. It is always for exactly 20% of the invoice amount, and it is always made to this entity." On the screen appeared the corporate filing for a shell company, KM Solutions. "And the sole registered agent and beneficiary of KM Solutions," Frank concluded, clicking to the final slide which showed the signature page, "is Karen Miller." The room erupted. It was no longer just murmurs and gasps. It was a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated rage. "Thief!" someone shouted. "Embezzler!" screamed another. Mr. Rodriguez stood up, his face flushed with anger. "You harassed my family over sidewalk chalk while you were stealing from us." Mrs. Gable stood as well, her voice trembling but strong. "You fined me for feeding birds, you wicked woman. You should be ashamed." One by one, the allies I had cultivated stood up and spoke, their personal stories of harassment and petty fines now recontextualized as distractions, as the actions of a bully trying to maintain control while she fleeced the very people she was tormenting. It was a cascade of public condemnation, and Karen had nowhere to hide. She tried to speak, to bang her gavel, but her voice was drowned out by the chorus of her angry neighbors. Gerald, the treasurer, had his head in his hands, openly weeping. Barb, ever the pragmatist, was already inching her chair away from Karen, literally creating physical distance from the implosion. I stepped back to the microphone one last time. "I believe," I said, my voice cutting through the din, "that we have several more motions to consider tonight." I held up a stack of papers my lawyer had prepared. First, a motion for the immediate removal of Karen Miller as president of this association for cause. Second, a motion for the immediate removal of the entire board for gross fiscal negligence. And third, a motion to authorize our legal counsel to turn over Mr. Kowalski's findings to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. Before a vote could even be called, 2 uniformed police officers, whom I had asked to be on standby in the parking lot, walked into the room. The sight of them shocked the chaos into a sudden, focused silence. They walked directly to the front table, their expressions grim. One of them spoke, his voice calm but firm, addressing Karen. "Ma'am, we've received a credible report of felony embezzlement. We need you to come with us." The finality of it was absolute. The war that started with a can of hunter green paint had ended here, in a beige community center, with the quiet click of handcuffs. The immediate aftermath of the meeting was a scene of controlled chaos. As the police officers escorted a sputtering, weeping Karen Miller out of the community center, a strange mixture of elation and sobriety settled over the residents. They had won. The tyrant was deposed. But now, the hard work of cleaning up her decade-long mess had to begin. Gerald and Barb, the remaining board members, resigned on the spot, scribbling their resignations on the back of meeting agendas before scurrying out of the room like rats from a sinking ship. In the power vacuum, the community, for the first time in years, began to actually function as a community. An impromptu session was called right then and there. Mr. Rodriguez, the construction worker Karen had harassed, was nominated and unanimously voted in as the interim president. A new interim board was formed, consisting of Mrs. Gable and 2 other reasonable, respected homeowners. Their first official act was to vote unanimously on all 3 of the motions I had proposed. The recall was official, and the evidence against Karen was formally handed over to the authorities. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. My lawyer, working pro bono for the new board, guided them through the legal minefield Karen had left behind. They had to untangle contracts, review years of financials, and formally terminate the agreement with Green Pastures Landscaping. A forensic accountant was brought in, and his findings were even worse than we had imagined. Karen's kickback scheme was just the tip of the iceberg. She had been using the HOA credit card for personal expenses, groceries, spa days, even a cruise to the Bahamas, all coded as community supplies or board development. The total amount she had embezzled over the years was well over $100,000. The criminal case against her was swift and decisive. Faced with Frank's ironclad evidence, she had no choice but to plead guilty. She was sentenced to 2 years in state prison and ordered to pay full restitution, which meant selling the very house from which she had terrorized her neighbors. The day the for sale sign went up on her lawn, a quiet cheer went through the neighborhood. The changes in Oakhaven Estates were immediate and profound. The new board, led by Mr. Rodriguez, went through the thick book of bylaws with a red pen. The draconian rules about mulch color, mailbox design, and flag dimensions were struck. The new guiding principle was simple. As long as you weren't actively damaging property or creating a public nuisance, you were left alone. The atmosphere shifted from one of suspicion and paranoia to one of neighborly tolerance. People started talking to each other again. Kids' laughter, once a source of potential violation notices, was now just a normal, welcome sound. The first official act of the new board was to pass a resolution. It was a single sentence, formally commending me for my extraordinary service to the community and declaring that the color hunter green was now an officially pre-approved color for all exterior doors. It was a small, symbolic gesture, but it meant the world to me. Frank sent me a final invoice. It was for the full $10,000 the old board had paid him. Attached was a check made out to the Oakhaven Estates HOA for that same amount. The memo line read, "Refund. Services not rendered as described." I handed the check to Mr. Rodriguez at the next board meeting, explaining that it was the last of Karen's ill-gotten gains being returned to the community. With the money, they threw a neighborhood-wide barbecue, the first one in years that wasn't fraught with the tension of Karen's watchful eye. Frank and I became something of local legends, the old spies who had brought down a corrupt regime. But the truth was, the victory didn't belong to us. It belonged to Mrs. Gable, who found her voice to stand up to a bully. It belonged to the Rodriguez family, who refused to be intimidated. It belonged to a community that had finally remembered that a homeowners association is supposed to be about association, about neighbors working together, not a fiefdom for a petty dictator. A few months later, on a quiet Saturday morning, I was out in my garden pruning my roses. The air was peaceful, filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. A golf cart pulled up to my curb, but it wasn't the ominous vehicle of the old regime. It was Mr. Rodriguez, a smile on his face. "Morning, Colonel," he said. He had taken to calling me that, a sign of respect I found both embarrassing and endearing. "Just wanted to let you know the board approved the new playground equipment. The kids are going to lose their minds." "That's great news, Alex," I said, snipping a spent bloom from a rose bush. "Great news." He looked at my front door, gleaming in the morning sun. "You know," he said with a chuckle, "and I'm thinking of painting my door that color. It's starting to grow on me." We shared a laugh, a simple, easy moment between two neighbors. He drove off to finish his rounds, and I was left alone in the quiet of my garden. I looked at my house, at my perfectly manicured lawn, and at my defiant hunter green door. The peace I had been searching for when I moved here, the quiet order I had craved, I had finally found it. I just had to fight a war to get it, but as I stood there, surrounded by the fruits of that victory, the vibrant roses, the peaceful silence, the sense of a community restored, I knew it had been a war worth fighting. Every notice, every fake report, every moment of tension had been an investment in this tranquility. And as I turned to go back inside, I felt Eleanor's presence there with me, smiling at the color of our door. The dust from the great HOA upheaval settled slowly, like morning mist burning off a field. Life in Oak Haven Estates found a new, more relaxed rhythm. The oppressive tension that had once hung in the air, the feeling of being constantly watched and judged, was gone. It was replaced by the mundane sounds of suburban life. Lawnmowers on a Saturday, the distant shouts of children playing, the friendly wave from a neighbor checking their mail. The new board, under Alex Rodriguez's steady leadership, proved to be exactly what the community needed. They were practical, transparent, and, most importantly, they seemed to genuinely like their neighbors. Meetings were no longer tribunals, but brief, efficient affairs focused on practical matters like pool maintenance and holiday decorations. The monthly newsletter, once a source of dread filled with warnings and threats, became a single cheerful page announcing community events and congratulating residents on new babies or graduations. My own life returned to the quiet routine I had originally sought. My days were spent in my garden, in my workshop, and with the small, satisfying challenges of my security consulting work. My notoriety as the man who took down Karen Miller faded into a quiet respect. People still called me Colonel, and I still found it a little awkward, but I understood it for what it was, a recognition of the order I had helped restore. My relationship with Frank also settled back into its normal professional rhythm, though our phone calls now often included a moment of shared, dry amusement as we reminisced about the Oak Haven operation. He had become a minor celebrity in the private investigation community after word of the story got out, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most satisfying cases aren't the ones with the highest stakes, but the ones with the most poetic justice. One afternoon, about a year after the infamous annual meeting, I was on my front porch, enjoying a glass of iced tea, when a large moving truck rumbled down the street. It pulled up and parked in front of Karen's old house. A young family got out, a man, a woman, and two small children who immediately started chasing each other across their new lawn. I watched them for a while, a feeling of deep satisfaction washing over me. This was the point of it all. This was the prize. A community where a family could move in and feel welcomed, not scrutinized. The father, a man about my son's age, saw me watching and gave me a friendly wave. I waved back. Later that day, I walked over to introduce myself. His name was Ben, an engineer at a local tech firm. "We heard some crazy stories about the old HOA president before we bought the place," he said with a laugh. "Something about a private eye and embezzlement?" I just smiled. "This is a good neighborhood, Ben. Good people. You'll like it here." It was the truth. The battle had forged a bond among the residents who had stood together. Mrs. Gable now hosted a weekly bird-watching club. The families who had been harassed over their children's toys now organized weekend play dates in the park. We had been a collection of houses, but now we were a neighborhood. The legal case against Karen's co-conspirators concluded quietly. Gerald, the treasurer, had cooperated fully with the investigation, and received probation in exchange for his testimony. Barb, who had feigned ignorance, was found civilly liable for negligence and had to pay a hefty fine back to the HOA. Dennis Miller's company, Green Pastures, went bankrupt, and he faced his own legal troubles for his role in the kickback scheme. The system, for once, had worked. Justice had been methodical, thorough, and complete. My front door remained hunter green. It had become an unlikely landmark. New residents were sometimes told the story of the green door that brought down the HOA, a local folk tale about the quiet veteran who had stood his ground. It was an exaggeration, of course. The door was just a catalyst. The real problem had been the rot in the foundation of the community's leadership, a rot that I had simply been the one to expose. The true victory wasn't mine alone. It belonged to everyone who had been cowed into silence and finally chose to speak up. One evening David called. He was back stateside, and he, his wife, and my granddaughter were coming to visit for a week. "Dad," he said, "make sure you have the ammo can. I want to show Sarah your medals." I looked across my living room at the polished wooden display case on the wall, the medals gleaming behind the glass. The ammo can itself was now sitting on a shelf in my garage, a memento of a different kind of campaign. "Don't worry, son," I said, a smile in my voice. "It's secure, and the backyard is clear for landing." We both laughed. The war was over, the peace had been won, and it was a good, quiet, and deeply satisfying peace. As I hung up the phone, I walked to the front of the house and looked out the window. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over the neat houses and the green lawns of Oak Haven Estates. It was just a quiet suburban street, nothing special to the outside world. But to me, it was a battlefield that had been turned back into a sanctuary. And that was a victory worth more than any medal in a box. The door was just a door, the paint just a color. But what it represented, the right to a small, personal piece of the world that was truly your own, free from the meddling of petty tyrants, that was something worth defending. And in the end, we had defended it together. The visit from David and his family was a balm. My granddaughter, Sarah, was a whirlwind of toddler energy, and for a week, my quiet, orderly house was joyfully disrupted by scattered toys, sticky fingerprints on the windows, and the sound of her delighted squeals. It was a beautiful chaos. On their last day, David and I were sitting on the back patio watching Sarah attempt to build a tower of blocks on the grass. He looked around at the peaceful, manicured yards that bordered my own. "It's hard to imagine this place as a war zone," he said, shaking his head. "When you first told me the plan, I thought you were losing your mind. Staging fake dead drops, nighttime digs, all over a homeowners association." I took a sip of my coffee. "Every conflict has its own unique terrain, David. This one wasn't fought with bullets and bombs. It was fought with bylaws and bank statements. The principles are the same. Know your enemy, control the narrative, and choose your battlefield." He pointed toward the old oak tree at the edge of my property. "So that's where we unearthed the cache?" he asked with a grin. "That's the spot," I confirmed. "It's probably the most exciting thing that's happened under that tree in 50 years. We both laughed. It all seemed so distant now, the anger and the tension of that time. It had been replaced by a deep sense of contentment. The fight had been necessary, but the peace that followed was the true reward. After they left and the house returned to its usual quiet, I found myself reflecting on the nature of the community we had rebuilt. The fear that Karen had used as her primary tool of governance was gone. In its place, something far stronger had taken root: mutual respect. People still kept their lawns neat and their houses in good repair, but they did it out of pride of ownership and consideration for their neighbors, not because they feared a fine. The infamous Architectural Review Committee had been rebranded as the Community Improvement Committee, and its new function was to organize volunteer efforts like planting flowers at the neighborhood entrance or helping elderly residents with yard work. Power had been transformed into service. The ultimate symbol of this change came in the form of a letter I received a few months later. It was from the new board, a formal invitation. The community had decided to use some of its reserve funds, the same funds Karen had once pilfered, to build a small pavilion and picnic area in the common green space. They were holding a dedication ceremony, and they wanted me to be the guest of honor and say a few words. I was hesitant at first. I'd never sought the spotlight. My actions had been born of necessity, not a desire for recognition. But Alex Rodriguez insisted. "You showed us what this community could be, Colonel," he told me over the phone. "It's only right that you're there when we celebrate it." The day of the dedication was bright and sunny. The entire neighborhood turned out. The new pavilion was simple but well made, a testament to what could be accomplished when community funds were used for their intended purpose. Children played on the newly installed swings, their parents chatting and laughing nearby. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. I looked out at the faces of my neighbors, Mrs. Gable, the Rodriguezes, and all the others who had stood with me. "A community isn't just a collection of houses, c'est faux," I said. "It's a covenant. It's a promise we make to each other to be considerate, to be fair, and to look out for one another." For a while, we lost sight of that promise. We allowed rules to become more important than people. But today, looking out at all of you, I see that promise has been restored. This pavilion isn't just made of wood and shingles. It's a symbol of that restored promise. Thank you. As I stepped down, the applause was warm and genuine. It wasn't for me, the individual, but for the idea of what we had all accomplished together. Later, as the party was winding down, a woman I didn't recognize approached me. She was one of the new residents, part of the family who had bought Ben's house after he was transferred for work. "Excuse me," she said a little shyly. "You're Colonel Thorne, right? I just wanted to thank you. We moved here because we heard it was a place where neighbors actually helped each other. A real community." Her words were the final, quiet confirmation of our victory. We hadn't just removed a corrupt president. We had fundamentally changed the culture of the place we called home. We had transformed Oak Haven Estates from a place governed by suspicion into one defined by trust. My hunter green door was no longer a symbol of defiance. It was now just a part of the diverse, colorful tapestry of the neighborhood. Next to it, the Rodriguezes had painted their door a cheerful canary yellow. Down the street, the house that had once belonged to Karen Miller was now owned by a young artist, and its door was a vibrant, unapologetic shade of purple. And nobody, not a single person, had a problem with it. The property values, by the way, had never been higher.